Hello, everyone. Welcome to this month's edition of the Stay-at-Home Lecture Series. My name is Tim Nutt. I am the director of the UAMS Historical Research Center located on the UAMS campus in Little Rock. We are part of the UAMS Library, and our mission is to collect and preserve the history of not only UAMS, but also the history of the health sciences throughout Arkansas. So glad you're here today. Um, Let me tell you a little bit more about the UAMS Historical Research Center and about the Society for the History of Medicine and the Health Professions, which is the sponsoring organization for this series. As I mentioned, the Historical Research Center is the archives division of UAMS, and we are located in the UAMS library on the fifth floor at the main campus in Little Rock. And as I mentioned before, we do preserve the history of UAMS. So we're the institutional record of UAMS. And we do that in a number of ways to preserve that record. We have, of course, the official documents of UAMS, like departmental reports, budgetary reports, things like that. But we also have photographs that document the expansion and the evolution of UAMS. And then a second part of that is the history of the health sciences in Arkansas. So something that deals with the medical community might not necessarily have to do with UAMS, but we're still interested in collecting that. We're the only archives in the state that's solely dedicated to the preservation of the health sciences history of the state. Now, the Society for the History of Medicine is our support organization, and they help us in just so many ways. In addition to uh, uh, financial support, they will help us buy and purchase materials for our collection. We have a history of medicine book collection, which they help us purchase books for. But then they also sponsor programming, such as the stay-at-home lecture series. The lecture series was started in 2020 at the beginning of the pandemic, and so we've just continued that. The lectures are held the first Thursday of every month, and from 12 to 1, and they focus on different topics dealing with the health sciences in Arkansas. If you'd like to join the Society for the History of Medicine, we'd love to have you as a member. The dues are inexpensive. It's $15 for an individual and $5 for a student. And you do not have to be a student here at UAMS. You could be a student in any of the colleges around Arkansas or around the country or the world for that matter. Or even if someone is in high school and they're interested in the history of medicine and the health sciences, we would love to have you as a member. If you'd like to learn more about the society, you could go to the URL that is on your screen there. That's talks about the society, gives you options for joining at different membership levels. But if you'd like to skip that and you've already made up your mind that you are interested in joining, you can just go to paypal.me/shmhp and you can just pay your dues online. If you have any questions or anything that come up after this presentation, you'd like to get a hold of me, the departmental email is on your screen, hrc@uams.edu, or you also have my phone number on the screen. I'd love to talk to you. Um, and if you're also interested in getting a tour of the Historical Research Center, we'd love to show you what we have. So, as I mentioned, the stay-at-home lectures are held the first Thursday of every month. With that being said, there will not be one next month, unfortunately, because we had a conflict. But we will be back in October, and we do send out email announcements about upcoming programs. So if you'd like to use that or be on that list, just send an email to that hrc@uams.edu email, and I'll be happy to put you on the list and give you some advance notice to programming and other events that we're going to be doing. So today I'm really excited. We're going to talk about the history of St. Bernard's Healthcare in Jonesboro. This is their 125th anniversary. And my mother's family on my has a really strong connection to St. Bernard, so I'm really interested in this program and talking a little bit about their history and their impact on the community of Jonesboro and just all of the good things that they've done throughout their 125 years of existence. So let's get into the history. If you have a question during my presentation, please feel free to use the chat feature. We'll most likely wait until the end of the presentation to answer any questions, but feel free to go ahead and type those in if you'd like to do that. So St. Bernard's, if you've been to Jonesboro lately, you realize and you understand just how large the campus of St. Bernard's is in Jonesboro. It's probably maybe the largest employer in Jonesboro. I'm not sure about that, but it's certainly one of the big economic drivers of Jonesboro, and the explosion of growth with St. Bernard's just in the last few years has really been amazing to watch. But the picture that you see on the screen is a view of a portion of the campus of St. Bernard's in Jonesboro. But obviously they didn't start out looking this way. So let's go back in time and just see how they got to this point in their history. So to do that, we first have to talk about the nuns that came to Arkansas and helped found St. Bernard's. So the nuns that came to Northeast Arkansas originally, they came from Convent Maria Rickenbach in the Unterwalden canton in Switzerland. This is in the late 1880s, 1870s, 1880s, and they first went to Missouri as a way to teach in the mission fields of America. So America was still considered a missionary status. So 5 sisters from Switzerland were sent in 1874 to Conception, Missouri, near Maryville, and to sort of set up their hub in America where they could form schools and teach school children and sort of spread the gospel of the Catholic Church. Additional sisters followed the next year, and then in the late 1880s, they were asked by some of a priest in Arkansas if they would be willing to come down to Pocahontas in Northeast Arkansas to help set up a school and administer to the settlers that were coming into the area. So that was at the request of Father Eugene Weibel. He too was a native of Switzerland. He had come to America in the 1870s, and Father Weibel is known as the missionary priest of Arkansas, because during his tenure in Arkansas, he went around the entire state, and he probably is probably the most prolific priest in the history of the Diocese of Little Rock who founded so many parishes and institutions around Arkansas. So not only in Northeast Arkansas is Father Weibel uh, uh, credited with establishing these parishes in Pocahontas and Jonesboro, Peach Orchard, all these places up in Northeast Arkansas, but also all around the state. He was active in Hot Springs. He was active along the Arkansas River Valley with the German settlements along the River Valley, and even far down in Southeast Arkansas in Lake Village. His passion for the church spread. So he is really known, as I mentioned, as the missionary priest of Arkansas. Now, in addition to Father Weibel, who is a, you know, very, he was in high stature in the Catholic Church in Arkansas. And at this time, you know, there weren't that many priests in Arkansas in the 1870s and 1880s. And the Catholic population itself was very low itself. And that really changed in the 1880s because of the bishop at that time, Bishop Edward Fitzgerald. Bishop Fitzgerald was a native of Ireland. He was the second bishop of Little Rock. Um, and I mentioned the Diocese of Little Rock. It's founded in 1843. Even though it's called the Diocese of Little Rock, it encompasses the entire state of Arkansas. It still does to this day. At some point, it also encompassed what is now Oklahoma. But so the entire state is under the Diocese of Little Rock. So Bishop Fitzgerald, when he came to Arkansas and he was installed as the second bishop of Arkansas in 1868, one of his main goals was to attract more immigrants to Arkansas, particularly German immigrants. And he is credited with bringing hundreds and hundreds of new immigrants to Arkansas, Catholic immigrants, mostly German, but also some Irish and other nationalities. So between Bishop Fitzgerald and Father Weibel, the immigrants that came to Arkansas in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s were really looked after and really cultivated and tended to. So Father Weibel's influence on St. Bernard's is really unparalleled, and he did so much for the establishment of the hospital and the parishes in Northeast Arkansas. So Father Weibel, he persuaded Bishop Fitzgerald to support his efforts to bring the sisters down from Missouri down to Northeast Arkansas to teach in the parish school at Pocahontas, which had been founded by Father Weibel. After a while, the sisters at Conception, Missouri, agreed, and they sent 4 sisters down to Northeast Arkansas. And in that first group of sisters, Mother Beatrice Ringley, Sister Agnes Dolly, and they came first, and then later they were joined by Sister Frances Metzler, Sister Walburger McFadden, and they came to Northeast Arkansas later. And there's a picture of Mother Ringley and Sister Agnes. And so when they got to Pocahontas in the late 1880s, they started the St. Paul's School at Pocahontas, which was the first Catholic school in Arkansas for African-American children. And so they were very instrumental in early education of group of individuals that were mostly overlooked in education and tending to their spiritual needs. So the sisters really focused on the Black community at St. Paul's School in Pocahontas. Now, at the same time, they had established their convent in Pocahontas, Maria Stein. But in 1898, the sisters moved the convent to Jonesboro. And that was mainly because of the railroad. The railroad had bypassed Pocahontas. And so they felt like maybe Jonesboro might be a better hub for their efforts. And so they moved their convent down a little south, not too far away, into Jonesboro in 1898. Now, by the following year, they would be tasked with tending to the sick, which is something that the sisters had not planned on. They had no experience whatsoever in caring for the sick. Let me see. And so just a little note here, when they moved the convent to Jonesboro, the name was also changed to Holy Angels Convent, and that'll come into play later as well. And so the population at this time in 1900 was about 4,500, just to have in your mind how big the city was at that time. So so in early 1900, a malaria outbreak occurred in Northeast Arkansas. There were no medical facilities in that part of the state, and actually very few in the whole state for that matter. In 1900, Little Rock had one hospital. They had St. Vincent's Hospital, which had been established in 1884. But in the Northeast part, there were very few doctors or very few medical facilities. And so Bishop Fitzgerald asked the sisters to help take care of the sick. And as I mentioned, they had no experience with this. But they willingly took on the assignment given to them by Bishop Fitzgerald. So in early 1900, they start thinking, well, we need a hospital to take care of these people. And so they established St. Bernard's Hospital in Jonesboro. Now, to do that, obviously, when you start a hospital, you need some sort of money to help set it up. So they appealed to the community. Father Weibel raised $500 by raffling off a gold watch, and that became the first donation for a fund to establish the hospital. And to raise additional money, Dr. Lutterloh and Dr. Burns went along with Father Weibel, and they went door to door asking for contributions and donations to help support this new hospital. A local merchant, Edward Wheeler, he also went around Jonesboro and surrounding areas looking for donations. And the sisters themselves actually helped as well by creating and selling embroidery work. And so it really was a grassroots effort to build and to found St. Bernard's Hospital in 1900. And the sisters, they saw a need, and they stepped into that void. And since then, the mission of St. Bernard's Hospital has always been the same, to care for the sick, regardless of race and later ethnicity. But really humble beginnings at the beginning of 1900 with the founding of St. Bernard's. Photo of Dr. Lutterloh. As I mentioned, he went door to door. So he was one of the big early supporters of the hospital. Now, as I mentioned, St. Bernard's or the sisters, they were first reluctant to open a hospital because they didn't feel like they had the knowledge or the skills to do that. But Father Weibel persuaded them, and I imagine Father Weibel was a pretty persuasive man. And as I mentioned from the beginning, their mission was to provide care to those in need, regardless of their ability to pay. So as the 1800s closed and we got into 1900 and the hospital was founded, the $5,000 that needed to be secured for that hospital had been accumulated. And so the hospital was founded. The people affected with malaria were treated. Let me see, looking at my notes. So J.F. Mason, who was a leader in Jonesboro, later became the advisory board chairman for the hospital. He contributed $100 to the hospital fund. And then his name was used when they were trying to secure a building. And so they found this house, and they were able to purchase the house for the first hospital. The house was a large frame house on East Matthew Street in downtown Jonesboro. In that house, 6 rooms were prepared with cots for beds, and they used covered orange crates for washstands. And the hospital officially opened on July 5th, 1900. So you can see in the postcard on your screen, you can see the original frame, the house, the frame building in the foreground. That's the original St. Bernard's Hospital. And then back behind them, that's an addition that we'll talk about later. And then the building on the far left is the convent. So, and here's just a sandbar map. This is from 1901, and I wanted to show you this just to sort of show you, and we'll have others as we go through the program, just the evolution and the development of the campus of St. Bernard's Hospital. So in the lower right on your screen, you can see that little frame building, 1901, the year after the hospital was founded. You see St. Bernard's in the lower right. And this square here, so it's bounded on the west by Church Street. You have Matthews on the south. Can't remember which street is on the north, and then you have Carson on the east. And so that square became the footprint, the physical footprint for St. Bernard's. And it's just amazing through the years how they went from this one building in that lower right and basically filled up that entire lot. But also on this in 1901, you can see St. Roman's Roman Catholic Church up in the sort of the near upper left of the screen. And then you have the school, the St. Roman's School, just to the sort of the right, diagonally of the Catholic Church there. So you can see that there's this sort of the Catholic enclave, as it was, is beginning to form in Jonesboro. So 1900, the hospital is founded. The first African-American patients were admitted to the hospital in 1901 by Dr. Lutterlow. And that happened because there was a landslide at a local quarry, and the physician determined that some of the victims could only be saved by performing amputations. And the hospital, the operating room at the hospital was the only suitable place that could happen. So Dr. Lutterlow asked the hospital if he could use those facilities, and the sisters agreed, and Black patients were cared for at St. Bernard's beginning in 1901. However, not everyone was happy with that. The hospital received threatening letters, threatening them to burn down the hospital because of their admission of Black patients. And so a lot of the physicians who had come into the hospital resigned, and that left only Dr. Lutterlow as the only physician still practicing at St. Bernard's. Later, the physicians came back, and by 1902, a section of the hospital had been opened for Black patients. So the hospital was, by 1902, offering services to both the white and Black communities of Jonesboro. So in 1901, something else happens. They had outgrown their space from that small frame house that they purchased in 1901. So in 1901, they purchased a second frame house, and you see that on the far right of your screen. Moved it a little bit closer to the hospital, and then they joined it with a little sort of a hallway in between the two. So their St. Bernard's first expansion happened immediately after the founding of St. Bernard's in 1900. And by a year later, they had already outgrew their space. By 1905, again, they had outgrown their space, and they decided they needed a new an annex to the hospital. The annex, it was expected to cost around $30,000. It was a brick addition. It could hold held 40 beds. And so that was built, and Bishop Fitzgerald gave the first 1,500 for that annex to be built. He was the first one to give money for that. The new addition, it was about, as I mentioned, it was brick. You can see it in the back behind the original frame building. It was about a 50 by 50 building, thoroughly modern, what the newspaper said. It had modern lights and steam, and the total cost ended up being $30,000, which was a lot of money in 1905. Another thing I want to mention at this point, the newspaper article mentioned that they were equipped with modern lights. And it's because of St. Bernard's that actually that whole section of town got electric lights. And they came in probably about late 1900, early 1901. But that section of town, the citizens of that section of town were often overlooked. And so the newspaper says that one of the reasons why street lights, the electric street lights, were placed in the neighborhoods was because of St. Bernard's. I mean, St. Bernard's put up lights for the safety of their patients and for taking care of them, the hospital itself. And so because of that, the citizens, the residents around St. Bernard's were given electric street lights by the city. So the St. Bernard's was a big influence on the development of that part of Jonesboro, and it's Jonesboro itself, as we're going to see. So the cost of the building, as I mentioned, was around $30,000. Financial challenges were always an issue at St. Bernard's, and space and accommodations were always going to be an issue for St. Bernard's. The hospital continued to grow, adding buildings and services throughout the years. And so eventually it sort of became, one building connected to another, sort of like a little hodgepodge. But this is the 1908 Sanborn fire map. And so remember, so by this time there had been 2 additions to St. Bernard. So in the lower right on this drawing, on the far right and I wish I had a little, let me see if you can see my cursor. So right here, so this is the frame house that they purchased for an annex. This is the hallway or veranda connecting the old hospital right here and the new annex, the 1901 annex. And then here you have the 1905 annex, the brick building right behind it. And then you'll notice that the church has moved over here, connected to St. Bernard's. The old church is a hall now. And then you have the convent and school right sort of to the north of the Catholic Church there. And then you have a laundry building that was built sort of out on the outskirts of the property near Carson Avenue. So you can see that the footprint of St. Bernard's has expanded greatly in only a few years. So in 1919, of course, their hospital's expanding. They're adding all these new services and everything. And the sisters were were the nurses in the building. They did not have any formal education, as we know, but the decision was made to have two of the sisters sit to take the state board exam for nursing, and they did that in 1919. And Sister Hilda Gabler and Sister Pia Weiss, maybe, I don't know how to pronounce her name. Well, they were the first 2 nurses from St. Bernard's to take the exam, and they passed. So they were the first 2 registered RNs at St. Bernard's. After those 2 passed, other sisters went through they started the nursing school, the St. Bernard's Nursing School, and the first class of that nursing school were other sisters who had been working in the hospital and went on and became registered nurses. The second year of existence for the School of Nursing at St. Bernard's, lay students were allowed to attend. So you have this beginning of the School of Nursing starting up and training their nurses for their own facility. That would go on until mid-50s, I believe, early 1950s, when the school was closed because of accreditation issues. So I have a little, I'm going to read something to you. See, make sure I can find it. Oh, I lose it. Sorry, I have too many books here. Um, so, so the St. Bernard School of Nursing, they had some rules and regulations that you had to follow, and I just thought it was interesting to read some of these. So it had a schedule that you had to, and a list of fees that you had to adhere to. Every morning, the School of Nursing students, they rose, got out of bed at 6 a.m. They had the morning prayer at 6:25. They had breakfast at 6:30, and they reported to duty at 7. They had lunch at 11 o'clock, and then supper at 5. Then a night prayer, and then they went to their room at 9. And that's when everything had to be quiet, and then lights out at 10. And there was to be no loud talking and giggling, as well as unnecessary noises of any kind, such as slamming doors, banging utensils, pans, etc., against sinks, is to be avoided. It is forbidden for nurses to assemble in rooms or corridors for the purpose of idle gossip. And informality of any kind while on duty is prohibited. Nurses shall not walk through the corridors arm in arm or addressing each other without prefixing the title Miss. Things such as these are decidedly out of place while engaging in the serious task of caring for the sick. Nurses will direct and receive their personal telephone calls over the nurse's home telephone and limit them to 5 minutes. Gifts and invitations from patients may not be accepted without permission from the superintendent of nurses. This custom smacks of tipping and is therefore unethical. A nurse who fails to report to the proper authorities a serious mistake made by her, or who discloses a professional secret, is subject to dismissal. And finally, nurses are to stand when speaking to clergymen, doctors, superiors, and those in authority, and treat them with respect. So, and that was typical of most of the nursing schools of the day. But just a milestone in the history of St. Bernard's was the creation of the nursing school, and then allowing lay students to come into the nursing school, then later on become nurses at St. Bernard. So it wasn't all on the sisters to do everything. Obviously at this point, this St. Bernard's had gotten so big that the sisters themselves, small group of sisters, it was just impossible for them to do everything. So once again, by October 1922, the hospital was out of space, and the cornerstone for the new annex was built, or was dedicated. The new building replaced all except one of the old frame buildings. The original hospital became the nurses' residence. The new annex included a classroom and dining room for the students in the nursing program. Um, um, Sorry, I lost my place. And the building was brick, as you can see by by the picture on the screen. It was 3 stories high, included 5 operating rooms, sterilizing and prep rooms, a well-equipped obstetrical department, as well as lecture rooms. The new addition allowed St. Bernard's to care for nearly 1,300 patients. Nearly a quarter of those patients were charity patients. And so Obviously 1922, right before the Great Depression, there was a lot of poverty, a lot of rural communities in Northeast Arkansas at the time. And so sometimes, as was the practice, bartering was taking place as far as what patients could pay for their services there. And here is just some of the stuff that was brought in. Now, I'm reading this. There was a book written in 2000 by Sister Henrietta Hockel, one of the sisters at Holy Angels Convent, and she wrote a history of St. Bernard's from 1900 to 2000, the first 100 years. And this is what she says about the bartering and paying, how people paid for their services at St. Bernard's. In many instances, people often paid their bills using a barter system, as Mr. Cash Taylor of Monette, for example, paid the bill for his son's hand surgery with 3 loads of hay and corn he delivered for the convent animals. At that time, the sisters kept cows and chickens to supply food and horses to plow the garden. There is a chicken house and barn in the area beyond the garden near the corner of the present Jackson and Carson streets. And in 2000, I'm assuming it's still there, a parking deck is where that was. Um, One of the sisters recalled another similar financial arrangement. Quote, a year after a farmer from Bay, Arkansas, had surgery in the hospital and could not pay his bill, he returned to the hospital the following summer. He arrived with a truckload of garden produce. He said, quote, you sisters were so good to me when I was in the hospital and couldn't pay my bill. I told the Lord if he would help me make a good garden, I would bring a load to you. Since cash was scarce, all such gifts were gratefully received. Um, so again, that's not uncommon. That probably happened all over the state and the country, in rural areas of the country. But produce doesn't pay the bills, and so the sisters had to figure out a way to bring money in to keep St. Bernard's financially solvent. And so one of the things they did is, and this is just a picture, this is a current picture off Google Maps, um, where showing that that 1923 building is still incorporated in the campus of St. Bernard's. This is facing Matthews Street, I believe. So the sisters, to bring in money for St. Bernard's, actually had 4 approaches to funding the hospital. One, there was an expectation that some patients would pay. 2, community support and philanthropy, that support that was so crucial early on in the founding of the hospital. They really relied on that and those donations to come in to help pay for services and to keep the hospital going. 3, the barter approach, as we just talked about, barter approach. And then and 4th, the sisters worked to provide what was needed themselves. And so, if the hospital needed something and the sisters themselves could provide that, then they would. Often, it was sort of this is something that the sisters built. This is something that the sisters founded. And obviously they wanted it to continue and they wanted it to thrive. So it's just akin, if I did something that was from my heart that I had done, I would do everything that I could to make it thrive. And that's what the sisters did. And in 1928, they did something that really, I think, secured the financial stability of St. Bernard's. St. Bernard's was incorporated as a separate entity, and so it was separated from the convent. So with that separation would come other opportunities that maybe were not available if it had been still attached to the convent. The sisters were still involved in the running of the convent and the management of the convent and everything. And for all intents and purposes, they were no doubt, they were the owners of St. Bernard's. but creating St. Bernard's as a separate entity, I think would benefit the hospital later on. Let me see. I think I thought I had someone come in. So here's another Sanborn fire map. And just to show you, so now so down in sort of in the middle at the bottom, you have the East Matthews here. And then you have the 1923 building. So most of the frame buildings are gone, except that one to the right of that new 1923 building. You have the 1905 addition right behind it. You have the chapel, and you have the convent, and then you have an addition to the convent there, right to the north of that. Just to the east of the convent, you'll see that there's a new church. The name St. Romans, the church burned when it was rebuilt in 1933. It was named Blessed Sacrament Church. And so you see that facing Church Street, closer to Church Street now. You see the school just to the south of the church. You see the hall, the parish hall just to the south of the school. And then you see the nurses' house sort of in between the 1905 edition and the parish hall of the church. So you can see, just how big the campus has grown. And if you also look toward the right, you'll see where the Sanborn fire map noted where they had their chicken house. So the chicken house was kept way away from the hospital and the convents and everything. So it was a pretty good distance away. So things are growing. This is about probably 1940, I would say, late 1930s and 1940. So you can see just how big the campus has gotten just in 40 years. In 1950, the hospital celebrated its golden anniversary, and as part of that dedication, or part of that celebration, the highlight of it was the groundbreaking for yet another addition for the hospital. And on July 2nd, 1952, the new addition was dedicated. But the new addition, St. Bernard's, had a additional, or had 150 bed capacity. And the new addition was modern in every sense of the word. So this is from a booklet, the dedication booklet. I have it here. This was my mom's. And so it showed different images from inside the hospital and the different facilities that were the different services that were available. So you had diagnostic facilities, you had the clinical laboratory, you had the x-ray department, the record department, and let's see, those are things that I meant to take out, but they also had the maternity ward here, comprised the whole fourth floor of that new addition in the 1952 edition. And then you had a father's room, which I just think is great that they had the rattan furniture for the convenience of the waiting father there. I just think that's a great photo. So the booklet talked about the growth of St. Bernard. So in 1900, the hospital treated 133 people. By 1910, that had grown to 497. By 1920, a little over 1,100. But by 1950, it had grown to about 6,500 patients a year. So it's just exponentially growing in the number of patients that we're seeing every year. In addition, they had the training school that closed in around 1950, as I mentioned. They still hired people for nurses, aides, and practical nurses. And this is as I mentioned, my family has a long history with St. Bernard's. When my mom graduated from Holy Angels Academy, which was a school um, uh, sponsored by the Holy Angels Convent, um, right after school, she went to work at St. Bernard's Hospital as a nurse's aide. And she continued, she did that until she got married and started having kids and stayed at home. But, not just her, my mom was the oldest, but her sisters after her all ended up working at St. Bernard's. And one of my aunts actually ended up working for St. Bernard's for about 50 years. So obviously a good environment to work in. My mom had nothing but good things to say about her time at St. Bernard's in the late 40s and early 1950s. So again, by the early 1960s, they had run out of space again. So another addition was built in 1963, and you see it here: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, about an 8-story building there. So it just continues to grow and grow and grow. More beds were obviously added as these new additions were going in, and which is good because in the late 1960s, early 1970s, Jonesboro was hit with two catastrophic disasters. First, the 1968 tornado that came through Jonesboro uh, injured nearly 300 people. And most, if not all of them, were treated at St. Bernard's, excuse me. And then again, just a few years later in 1973, another devastating tornado came through, destroyed the high school, and again, St. Bernard's was there to help with the victims. So this might be the same map that I showed you earlier, but just to show that the growth of it up to the 1960s, just how big the campus had grown. 1974, the sisters, the hospital had really outgrown its physical uh, uh, campus, the physical the limitations of their campus. And so it was decided that they would take over the old convent building on the campus. And so in the fall of 1974, after living next to the hospital since its founding, the sisters, the Olivetan Benedictine nuns, Holy Angels Convent, they moved their convent to a location north of Jonesboro, which is where they are today. The hospital growth had paralleled the growth of Jonesboro itself, and so they needed more space. They needed the space that the convent took. At this time, there were more people, more lay administrators, more lay people coming in, working at the hospital. And so the sisters were still actively involved in the hospital, but there were also these new people coming in, not affiliated with the sisters. And so when they moved, St. Bernard's took over their convent, which was sort of on the north side of the campus. This building stood, it was built, I think, probably in the 1930s, maybe 1930, 2930, something like that. And this stood and was used as part of the hospital until its demolition in 2019, I believe. But I want to go back to this for just a second and talk about it. And I hope you can imagine when I'm describing this. So the original hospital down here towards Matthews Street. In 1933, you had Blessed Sacrament, the new church built. The old church had been somewhere around in here. The convent was right here. This is that square building, I believe, that I just mentioned, that I just showed you. So by this time, when the hospital started in 1900, it was just near East Matthews Street. So by the 1960s, 70s, mid 1970s, the hospital physical footprint had gone all the way a whole block from Matthews up to or bigger than a block actually, but had gone from Matthews up to, and I wish I could remember what street that is up on the top, but I can't. Um, and then all the way stretching from Church Street all the way over to Carson over here on the right. And so by the early 2000s, when all these, uh, uh, the hospital had grown so exponentially and it just run out of space, it basically had surrounded by I'd say probably the 90s, early 2000s, it had basically surrounded all of the Catholic Church. And so whenever you visited the Catholic Church, its entrance was on Church Street. It was just the hospital. You had the church, you had the school, and then all around it, you had the hospital. So the church itself had become just surrounded by the hospital. So by the late teens of the 2000s, it had really been determined that the hospital needed more space, and so Saint or Blessed Sacrament Church, excuse me, was decommissioned in 2017, and they moved out onto, I believe it's either Caraway or Nettleton. I can't remember which street they're on now. But so the church was decommissioned, the church was demolished, and then the hospital took over the space of the church and the school behind it. And so, now St. Bernard's it's a world-class hospital. It's grown from this just one frame house to the beginning to where it is now, encompassing multiple blocks in Jonesboro, offering all these services. And it's just a premier hospital in Northeast Arkansas. And it's all because of the nuns that came over originally from Switzerland, went to Missouri, then came down in the 1880s to start a school at Pocahontas. And from this group of nuns, grew St. Bernard's. And that's how we're here at the 125th anniversary of St. Bernard's. Just another view of St. Bernard's. I looked for an aerial view. I couldn't find one. And just a little bit of information about it. So it stayed at St. Bernard's Hospital for a long time. And then it was changed to St. Bernard's Regional Hospital, I believe in the 1970s, I believe. And then the term regional was dropped in 2004. And then now it's known today as St. Bernard's Healthcare. Jonesboro's grown so much. There are about probably 200,000, 250,000 people living in that area now that the area that it serves. And it just continues to grow. In 2019, it announced that it was leasing the Five Rivers Medical Center in Pocahontas. And then in December of 2019, St. Bernard's opened a new 5-story, $103 million medical tower on the main campus in Jonesboro. So it just continues to grow, continues to offer all these services to the people of Jonesboro and Northeast Arkansas and Southeast Missouri. So it's just really a testament to the sisters who started this, the 5 or 6 sisters that began this, and then it's turned into this multi-billion dollar, most likely, institution that really provides world-class care in Northeast Arkansas. This is just, they were announced as one of the best hospitals, I think, in the United States. That's what this picture is from. But it's just so nice to see St. Bernard's celebrating its 125th year, from humble beginnings to the powerhouse that it is now. So thank you all for being here. And I'm going to stop this share and turn on my screen and look at the questions and see, how do I turn this off? Nope, not that. Stop share. That's what I want. So let me move this over. And let me check the chat. Let's see. How many nuns made up the convent? I think there were originally maybe about 5 or 6, and then it grew to about 16. When my mom attended Holy Angels Academy in the 1940s, I think there were maybe about 20, 30 sisters there. I'm not sure, actually, Susan. Were lay students living on site or traveling in each day? I'm assuming they were probably traveling in each day. And if there's anyone here from St. Bernard's or from Jonesboro who could, if I'm wrong, correct me on that, I would appreciate it. A comment, there's a lot of Swiss German history in Arkansas, the Wiedekers and Altus, for sure. They're Swiss German and moved to Arkansas around the same time as the St. Bernard's nuns. That's correct. And they came in the Subiaco, the abbey, the monastery at Subiaco. They came in the mid 1870s, and they were a draw for the other German immigrants that came in during the Arkansas River Valley. And again, that was due to Bishop Edward Fitzgerald's his push to bring immigrants, especially German immigrants, into Arkansas. So we're almost out of time. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. And I want to take this last few minutes just to tell you about a few items that might help if you're interested in more about the history of St. Bernard's. As I mentioned, this is probably backwards. It's called A Century of Service, A Centennial History of St. Bernard's Regional Medical School Center, written by Sister, Henrietta Hockel. I don't know if this is still available. You might be able to find it on Amazon or a used bookstore, but it's really a good history book. Sister Henrietta, and Henrietta was a great historian. And then also there's just this new book that was put out for the 125th anniversary of the Heart of Great Medicine, 125 years of St. Bernard's healthcare. And you can contact the hospital. And I don't know if they're giving away these or they're selling these or what, but if you get in touch with St. Bernard's, they'll be glad to answer your questions. It's a great book too. A couple more, let me just make sure there's someone mentioned the Sisters' Missions and Sacrifice have made it the wonderful place. Dr. Givens, who works at St. Bernard's, he's had the privilege of working for St. Bernard's for the last 24 years. I just hear it's a really wonderful place. As I mentioned, one of my aunts worked there for 50 plus years. And the books are available for free at the Craighead County Public Library in Jonesboro. That's on Cherry Street in Jonesboro. So thank you all for being here. This program's been recorded. So if you're interested, this will be uploaded to YouTube probably in the next couple of weeks or so. And I'll be sending out a link to the folks on our distribution list. Again, if you'd like to be on that list, just let me know. I'm glad to add you. And then you can just forward this link, the video link, to anyone who might be interested in it. So thank you all for being here. Congratulations to St. Bernard's on their 125th anniversary. We're just so glad that St. Bernard's is there in Northeast Arkansas, and just really thankful for the dedication that the Olivetan Benedictine Sisters Holy Angels Convent has done for all of St. Bernard's in this last 125 years. So thank you all. Y'all stay safe, and we won't have a meeting or a lecture next month, but in October, and I'll be sending out an email about that. So thank you all for being here. Be safe, and we'll see you next time.